Okay, thanks for your patience. Everybody's happy to see our third panelist come in. It's a pleasure to be back here in Nur-Sultan, which has been a couple of years and back at the Astana Economic Forum. And this is one of the more relevant panel discussions that we have in 2019. Yesterday afternoon, I had a chance to sit into the one in this room on the death of multilateralism. How do we revive the institutions, and Dr. Fischer was on that panel as well. And I don't think we can look at this subject in isolation about how to manage a soft landing for the global economy without looking at the context of where we are today. I'm not sure how many of you have heard about the VUCA world, if you will. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. When I first talked or heard about the VUCA world, I thought it sounded more like a disease, like the classic VUCA infections that we get, or the common wart, something that we have with children, of course, in their school swimming pools and the rest. But it's, as one former prime minister told me last night over a nightcap, he said, we've never lived with so much uncertainty, and I think it's a fair comment. Maybe it's accentuated by the media climate today, particularly social media, layered on to the top of, after the fall of communism, the lowering of trade barriers, and a digital revolution. They've all come together over the last 25 years. And one would argue the pushback we see in the populism in many of the Western economies around the world is a product that just took 25 years to play out, which makes managing monetary policy all the more difficult. And I think we don't have to go back a quarter century to look at the challenges of today, but we can look in the context of what we see in the region where I'm sitting, which is the Middle East, with the uncertainty, of course, surrounding Iran, the change in leadership in Saudi Arabia and some of the unpredictability of that. The giant elephant in the room, of course, is what happens to the US and China relationship. $20 trillion economy, a $14 trillion economy, kind of going head to head on trade tariffs. And it's gotten so heated, and again, in the social media climate of the US president, it's very hard to climb down for both sides. And what does that mean? And with the steering committee here at the Astana Economic Forum, they were suggesting the ripple effects of that. What does that mean for Chinese growth? We've been very used to 9–10% for a couple of decades in a new climate of 6 to 6.5%. But what if China slows down at a much more rapid pace? What does it mean for Central Asia, Kazakhstan in particular as a trading partner? What does it mean about the relationship with Russia? And in this new climate, when do we start changing the policies that were derived after the 2008 to 2010 financial crisis? And that's the crux of our conversation today. Fantastic panel. I don't think we need to introduce them because they're so well known, but it's a real pleasure to have them. Maurice Obstfeld is a professor of economics at the University of California at Berkeley and was the chief economist at the IMF. Justin Lin, professor at National School of Development at Peking University and chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank between 2008 and 2012. And Dr. Stanley Fischer, vice chairman of the US Federal Reserve Board of Governors, and was also the head of the Bank of Israel as well. Let's give them a nice welcome to the AEF in our session today. I think having nearly a full room with so many different panels taking place is an indication of how important the subject matter is. What I'd like to do is keep it informal, so I've asked our panelists here that I'll ask them a question directed into their expertise and their subjects. They'll give a kind of a 2-minute framework, and the rest of it is all question and answer. And after 30 minutes of discussion here from the panel, I'd love to even come into the audience and get your input, because I really want to get a sense from those here in Kazakhstan, but into the developing world, how they see the transition in the developed world now to a different monetary policy stance. Maurice, do you want to start here in terms of the complexities of what I talked about, the convergence rapidly of geopolitics, perhaps impacting the ability for the central banks in the G7 countries to change course in terms of monetary policy? Is my premise correct here, that it makes it much more challenging because of the trade challenges that are on the table? Do you want to start there?
Sure.
That's okay, it'll come up. Can we get the microphone up, please? for the speaker. Thank you.
Do we have it?
Why don't I give you this?
Oh.
And there we go. There we go.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's much.
Rule number 1 in television is don't hit the microphone, but that's okay.
Oh, okay. I haven't been on television.
I know, I was
enough,
going to
so
say for a while.
sorry.
Okay, let's go. Thanks.
Yeah, well, when you sort of pair geopolitics and trade tensions, that makes me think of U.S.-China, and that is obviously a major elephant in the room. I think part of the current atmosphere of volatility and uncertainty, we see the markets fluctuate on every rumor of impending talks, impending deal, but a lot of that is from this bilateral relationship, and that's not all of it, of course. There are a lot of other things out there. There's Brexit. There's other geopolitical problems that are too obvious to even talk about. But the U.S.-China trade tensions is part of a larger geopolitical rivalry. These two countries are, at some level in an adversarial position, with China a rising power, extending its economic and political influence worldwide. U.S., to some degree retreating from international obligations, but also struggling to maintain global influence despite giving up a lot of the levers of soft power. And this creates an incredibly volatile environment. I mean, you mentioned the multilateral system in the last panel, in the earlier panel. Nobody has any sense of where we are, what the system, what parts of the system remains, and importantly, where leadership would come from should there be a new recession. In 2009, the G20 acted pretty effectively. Central banks acted pretty effectively and in concert. And where we would be today, I don't know. Even within the U.S., the president is at war, on a domestic front with the central bank. So it's no wonder that people are feeling a sense of disorientation.
Terrific. And Justin, I think let's start here, and then we can build back in terms of where China is. But the political premise I put on the table here is that President Xi has a sense of pride as well. You constantly hear a U.S. president say we've never grown faster, the unemployment rate's never been lower, we're the greatest things, and it's really overdue that we take on China and challenge them on trade, and they should give us greater market access. He's almost acting, and it's the same policy in the Middle East, as the last bully on the block in a unipolar world. Does it make it very difficult? I think it's very valuable to this audience to understand the thinking in China. Does it make it difficult for President Xi domestically not to stand up to President Trump and trying to find a compromise? Because it seems very little wiggle room here. You have to turn your microphone on. And I would bring it closer to you if you don't mind. Thank you very much.
Well, certainly it's a challenging issue to handle because trade is a win-win for every country. And China has every intention to maintain good relations with the U.S. because U.S. is the most important country in the world, a major power, and also a major market for China. However, I think President Trump, his policy is based on misunderstanding about the trade imbalance. Certainly China enjoys a balance of about 370 billion trade balance. But a lot of that was, processed trade. China imported a lot of intermediate products from other countries, other economies, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and even the US. So not all the trade surplus in China came from China itself. And so, the policy that adopted by President Xi, try to help the U.S. to understand that. But from so far, seems to me that the negotiation team in the U.S. still based on the deficit itself did not, try to understand the trade structure. And especially, how come the U.S. has such a large trade deficit? And if we do not handle those kind of things, certainly it would be very hard for China to cope with. And it's also very hard for China to, take all the demand from the U.S. because that's irrational and that will hurt China. And at the end, that will also hurt the U.S. And I hope our economic rationality will prevail someday.
Okay, let me follow up quickly, and then I'll go to Dr. Fischer. Can you see a compromise emerging between now and the G20 meeting? Because the G20 is almost irrelevant, unfortunately. Maurice talked about the fact that it played an instrumental role in the 2009-10 structure under Gordon Brown, the former prime minister, who was willing to use the G20 to have the collaboration. Stanley, you were part of that conversation, of course, because of the crisis that was on the table. Do you see ahead of the G20 that these two sides, cooler heads will prevail or not? That's the kind of a key question. Is there a climb down area in using again, Professor, the Chinese mentality of face as well and pride?
Well, certainly I hope it will. But President Trump has the tendency to make the last changes at the last moment. And so it's hard to predict.
So it keeps everybody off balance. So, Dr. Fischer, what does this mean for monetary policy? I was quite alarmed when I saw this move to call for the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates. And less than a month ago in Dubai, a former senior member of the White House said to me privately that Donald Trump, for re-election purposes, has 5 to 6% growth on his mind. That 3 to 4 is not good enough. He wants to be the man who walked away 5%, 6% growth and the implications of it. So, and sure enough, 2 weeks after I had that conversation, he was asking the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates. How dangerous is this president, and what does it influence in terms of a soft landing? Can the Federal Reserve really respond by cutting interest rates in this sort of climate, or will they be forced to because of the trade dispute is another question.
Well, thanks for inviting me to take part in this session. I want to just tell a little story, which is about Paul Volcker.
We want to spend 30 seconds on who most of us know Paul Volcker. Actually, I had to chase him down the hallways of Congress in the 80s, but he was a kind of a legendary central bank governor at the Federal Reserve. Do you want to take it from there?
Well, Paul Volcker is, I think he was 6'8" tall, which is 2 meters plus, and he's a big man. And he has the benefit of a voice and an accent that sounds like he's not very well educated. This is an excellent way of appearing in public and saying things which matter, but saying them in simple language. Volcker, I'd heard this story, and I checked it before coming here. Volcker said that one day in 1984 he received a request to visit the White House to see the president. He went to the White House to see the president, and he wasn't asked to go to the Oval Office. He was asked to go to the library of the White House. And when he got to the library, he found the president, Reagan, sitting there, he said, looking uncomfortable, and James Baker with him, who was his chief of staff. And he said, the president said hello, and then Baker said to him, the president orders you not to raise the interest rate before the elections. So he said, well, I knew that was illegal. He couldn't may order me to do anything. And I just didn't know how to reply. So I walked out. I didn't say a word. That's a pretty tough indication of independence. Well, he lasted another 3 years. And that is what will save the ability of the Fed for the next couple of years not to have to go along with what the president says, because the president is not legally allowed to give him orders about policy. Plain and simple. He can't dismiss him for disagreeing on policy matters.
But he does break through, though, Stanley. This is the challenge.
Right.
He was willing to stand up and do a kind of a public press conference and berate Jerome Powell to do something about it. So how do you put it in this new context of the rules are always broken by the president?
Well, the rules may be broken, but the Fed does not have to respond to the broken rules. And in the extreme, they can do what Volcker did and walk out. Powell knows that. But when it comes time to name the next head of the Federal Reserve Board, which will be in about two years, somewhat after the election, that's when this changes, and Trump can appoint somebody who will take orders, and that's the point at which this becomes very difficult. So yes, it's a danger. It's not an immediate danger. It's a danger of a couple of years away. And if he puts his candidates on the board. But I think the interesting thing is that the Republican Senate has shown not very much will to fight with the president. But on the president's nominations for the board of the Fed, he named two people, and basically the Senate, one of them didn't want to do it, and the Senate persuaded the other one not to put his name forward because they told him he'd lose. That was Moore. So that means the Senate is going to take this seriously, so it may be a much less of a problem than it seems, but it's going to be a problem.
Okay, let's drill into the subject matter here and how to manage the soft landing. So I'll do a quick follow-up, Stanley, if I may. What's the Fed's new position then in terms of monetary policy? A shift from what we enjoyed or witnessed for the last 10 years after the financial crisis, the very easy monetary policy, the QE2, gradual shift, sharp shift, don't touch it ahead of the elections? What's your view?
Well, there's no basis for cutting interest rates right now, except that the president wants to win the elections and make absolutely sure and make a mess after the elections, which is what will happen if we cut the interest rate by 100 basis points today. So the Fed won't do it. And then there'll be a conflict, and we'll see what happens. We have reached a stage where we don't have to have forward guidance and a variety of other things now in order to run a perfectly good old-fashioned monetary policy. You can do better than that, and we should do better than that. But there's nothing about monetary policy that is holding up growth.
Let's open this up to the panel. I'd love to get your thoughts across the board. The argument put forward by the U.S. president is that inflation is not a threat. So why don't we be a little bit more aggressive and juice up the economy? Maurice, you want to jump in, and then Justin, and we'll have Stanley on this as well. The premise, it's a new world, much more competitive world. Productivity is high, inflation's low. Why are we being so timid in Europe and the United States? You can just keep this on.
Thanks. A similar argument is put forward by proponents of modern monetary theory on the left. So it's interesting that this has come back. When people ask me this question, my answer is to think about measles, right? We haven't had measles in a long time. So people decide, well, maybe I don't need to be vaccinated. Maybe I can believe these things I see on the internet about the hazards of vaccinating my children. and we're seeing now the consequences of that belief, that measles is having a resurgence, and in fact it's very dangerous, especially for very, very young children. So, the idea that inflation is somehow dead, that it can't come back, this is an artifact of the very solid monetary policies that the Fed has followed. And, I don't think one can be complacent about that. The U.S. Is certainly last year and this year is going to be running above potential. The president believes that potential growth is much higher, but nothing in economic theory supports that until we see some very big developments in productivity. So the outcome of a big interest rate cut now will be inflation down the road and possibly more financial instability down the road. I mean, I sort of view the what he's trying to do a little bit differently. It's kind of a no-win strategy. I think he realizes that there'll be resistance from the Fed to cut interest rates, but by going on Twitter often and early, it positions him to blame the Fed if growth doesn't live up to what he has promised. And that's politically valuable because, I think this president is someone who searches for scapegoats. And, the Fed is certainly one. We know there are many others among foreign trading partners.
Right. The other thing I think we should bring into the conversation, Professor Lin, is this concept that some don't believe Chinese numbers that are out 6.5%. And we got a little bit spoiled for 2 decades of 8, 9, and 10%, right? So first and foremost, can we rely on this base of protecting 6% growth? Is it real? And in a climate where German exports picked up again to China, but there was concern when they started to slow down, can this transition in a very delicate trade environment, can China hold on to 6% growth, and is it for real to begin with? Thanks.
Well, it has been a question debated in academic community about whether the growth in China was real. And I think that the debate, certainly on the one hand, we have to say no statistics in the world is absolutely right. There must be some margin of, errors there. But I think the growth in China should be acceptable. In a sense, you can see the increase in the government revenues. If China did not have such a high growth rate, then the government revenue cannot increase so much. Otherwise, all the revenue, all the income in China will go to the government's hand. But we see in the past 40 years, the different standard in China improve a lot, and the trade in China improve a lot, infrastructure improve a lot. So all those, I would say, certainly you can always dispute whether the statistic is right or not. And if you use the same standard, you can dispute any country's statistics. But to China, I think the official figures are acceptable.
They're pretty accurate then, you're saying? Oh, interesting. Dr. Fischer, do you agree with this?
Yes.
You do? And why? You're looking at the same evidence that Professor Lin is looking at, that this is be justified?
Well, I'll give you a secret. People I trust tell me the numbers are right.
Within the government, I take it.
People, scholars who look at it.
Yes. So you're confident?
They say the data are pretty good. They may exaggerate by 1% or something, but they're not way off base.
Okay, good.
And by the way, I don't see how anybody who visited China in 1988, as we did, and visits now, can think that anything but a miracle took place there.
Yes. Vis-a-vis, say, an India, especially, which is now growing very fast, but if you look at the growth spurts of GDP in the last 30 years, stacked up against other economies of its size, it is a miracle. I want to be a little bit more provocative in terms of the outlook for China. Could the world withstand a slowdown of China. And this is the real danger of a trade dispute. You know, I've been doing financial journalism for 30 years, and we never talked about a trade war. If people did, we internally would suggest you can't throw that term around lightly. So can we acknowledge we're in a trade war, and what is the danger if China did slow down to 4%? What sort of shock would it be to Europe, the United States, ASEAN? Justin, you want to jump in, and then feel free to jump the others into the conversation.
And the first one, I think we need to see the baseline of the growth in China. And personally, I think it is very likely China will maintain at a growth rate of 6% and above in the coming few years.
It can sustain it. Okay.
And the main reason, there's some concern about the sustainability of China's growth. And it was because China's growth decelerated since 2010. In that year, the growth rate in China was 10.6%. And year by year, the growth rate slowed down. Last year, it was 6.6%. And 6.6%, certainly internationally, it is still very high. But in China, it is the lowest level that China ever achieved since 1990s. That's one thing. And secondly, it was the first time for China's economy to decelerate continuously for 8 years in the past. Certainly growth has some kind of an up and down, but every time when it slowed down for a few years, it will pick up. But this time it continued for 8 years. And so many people try to say, for causing this kind of deceleration, and depends on your understanding what are the causes, then it will shape your prospect for the futures. For some people think that to have 8 years of deceleration, it was due to some kind of internal problems, internal structural problems. For example, state-owned enterprises in China still play a very important role. And also, China's savings are very high. All those kind of structural issues, people point their fingers to that. But I think that China certainly, as a transition economy, China still have a lot of structural problems domestically. But for me, the main reason for the deceleration in the past 8 years were external and cyclical. Because we can see other BRIC countries, when we emerging market economies, they do not have the so-called structural problem in China. For example, high saving or the important role of the state-owned enterprises. But in the 8 years, their economy all decelerated. Exactly the same pattern. And also their deceleration were even sharper than China. And not only the emerging market economies, other high-income, high-performing, high-trade-dependent, East Asian economies, like Korea, Singapore, my home province, Taiwan. Exactly in that 8 years, they all decelerated, and much sharper than China. And they are high-income economies. Not only high-income, they are high-performing. That means in the past, their growth performance was much better than other high-income countries. But during the 8 years, they are all decelerated, and also much sharper. And the only explanation must be some common external, or cyclical problems. And I think that in terms of external, certainly we know, since 2008, the global financial crisis, the high-income countries, they were hit. They were the origin of the crisis. And to me, actually, the high-income country has now fully recovered to their growth potential and suppress the demand, suppress the trade, because we know before 2008, the trade growth in the world was about twice as high as the global GDP growth. Now the global GDP growth slowed down, and the trade growth was lower than the GDP growth. Certainly that affects trade, and the trade certainly is important for growth for every country.
Okay, very good. I want to pick up on these thoughts. Do we have the handheld microphones nearby? Do we have an extra microphone for the audience? Can we bring it up? Massimo, can you come in before you, I know you're leaving and you have to leave in 20 minutes. We have the global head of research for Banca Intesa from Italy. I just think it'd be good to have him weigh in if you can. If we can get the microphone to the front row, please.
Can I just say
Please jump in and then I'll call on you.
two things quickly? One is, we better not forget that this is part of a much broader fight over who dominates the world in more respects than the global economy. And that's part of what's going on, and that's part of why tempers are pretty strong. The second is, can the world withstand China growing more slowly? Yes. What does it mean? It means we'll all grow more slowly, slightly more slowly, depending on how much we trade with China. But I've been impressed watching the United States, which we were told would always have a 3% productivity growth rate, and didn't, and it hasn't sort of caused the collapse of the American economy, and so forth. People can get used to growth that slows down, and you know, there's no, if we can't produce more rapid growth than we have, we're going to have to learn to live with the growth we've got. Now, then you have to ask, what political problems does that lead to? And those are really the big issues that will determine the importance of whether we can withstand this period.
So there is a serious challenge. I wanted to call on Massimo because I know he has to leave.
Sorry, I just wanted to say.
No, not at all. It's perfect. No, just because he has to leave in the next 10 minutes or so. Of this debate about managing a soft landing, how do you see the conversation has been brought up by our distinguished panelists? And if you want to pose a question, feel free.
Yes,
Introduce
thank
yourself.
you very much. I have a question, in fact, because I think soft landing is for growing economies like China, like India, but if we look in Europe, for example, we have soft landing since the crisis of 2008. 1.5, 1.4% in the Eurozone is in a certain way a soft landing according to what we had in the 70s, in the 80s. So, and this is perhaps also the origin of populism and a crash we have in Europe in political and social terms. So the point is also perhaps a sort of trade-off between the growing economies right now, and also in soft landing, and Europe, which has soft landing, still soft landing. So my point is soft landing for who? And the trade-off between the big economies, what we call in the past big economies, and what we call in the past, I mean, developing countries which are not yet developing countries are still big economies like China.
Thank you very much for jumping in. Maurice, why don't you tackle this? And there's, I think, Massimo, too, we should bring in the equation of the populist surge that we see. Brexit's a product of it. The yellow vest movement in Paris is there. The hard right in Germany that kind of reared its ugly head. We see the five-star movement in Italy being quite aggressive on immigration. If you have this 1 to 1.25%, 1.5% environment, it wouldn't be acceptable in the climate we are in politically today, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in Europe, the problem is more making sure that you grow at least the potential, and that's become challenging. You know, as we've seen the data come in, I think we're a little bit less worried at this moment about a sharp European slowdown than we were a couple of months ago. But you know, we still see worrisome April data from Germany on industrial production, and you know, it's certainly clear that France is facing macro problems as a result of the, I meant macro and not Macron, but macro problems as a result of the yellow vest movement. Italy has returned to positive growth after a technical recession, but you know, it is a real challenge there. I mean, I think that in general, you know, when you ask the question about populism, we do have to look back to the 90s and realize that this was a period of exceptional and perhaps above potential growth, which had the political implication of papering over a lot of problems of rather long standing. And you know, the fact that we did not achieve a soft landing from that boom, far from it, the opposite. And we've achieved a rather tepid recovery afterwards compared to the growth that we had seen. And I think that's accentuated a lot of the political problems. You know, if we are going to...
Let's just be specific. It's just the harder reforms that should have taken place on pension reforms, the debt to GDP that's still there right now, the labor reforms that should have taken place.
No, absolutely. So if we are going to avoid a hard, you know, political landing, which I think is what we're really worried about in Europe but in other parts of the world, you know, governments have to say, okay, growth is what it is, and how can we use our resources in a better way to, you know, address problems of inequality, of, you know, youth unemployment, you know, general discontent with social mobility, and that requires very forward-looking behavior by politicians. You know, electoral cycles are short. I don't think populism is going to deliver on this if populists come to power more widely, but it is a challenge.
Stanley, you want to jump in? Can you bring your microphone closer to you? That'd be great.
Yeah, I don't actually have very much to contribute beyond that, except that the 6% growth countries, we do not have precedents of countries continuing to grow at 6%. They go down to 4 and 3, and I don't know that China will continue to grow at 6% from now on. Particularly if the global economy is operating more slowly. So I think that that's something that China will have to get used to at some point, if not immediately in the next few years. And, you know, they will, unless they have some magic ingredients, and if they have the magic ingredients, I hope they'll pass them along to us.
I thought I was going to come in here with this master plan of you guys telling us how we're going to manage the slowdown and get it sounds a little bit dire to say that we're in a slow growth period for a long period of time.
Well, we don't know that. We just don't know that. I mean, everybody assumes that. Then all of a sudden in the first quarter of this year, when I think everybody is expecting exceptional slowdown, we got 3.5%. We got less than 3%, but a significant increase in productivity growth. It's very hard to predict productivity, and we don't look like we're doing very well at it. And we've had all those discussions, whether we're mismeasuring it, which I think has got some claims to be believed. And we're going to do the best we can on monetary policy. I mean, we can talk about all these things like infrastructure. We have a president who has talked about infrastructure. He has shown no signs of being willing to do a damn thing about it. But, you know, you can talk. But we could do, there are things we could do which politically we seem incapable of doing. And if that's what's happening to us, well, we'll have to live with the consequences.
We had a question from the floor. If you can stand up, please. I will, Justin. I'll come back to you, please.
Спасибо. У меня три...
I have 3 questions, if you allow. Жубаев, Сапарбай, Жубаев, Сапарбай.
Devices for the... Go ahead.
Хорошо.
So I repeat, my name is Zhubayev Saparbai. I represent Kazakh University of Technologies and Business, Astana. The first question to Mr. Fischer: if the trade war between China and US achieves such level, will China be able to sell its sovereign bonds to the United States? The example of Russia here, we may remember. What will be the outcome? Will it delay the interest growth?
Thanks. I was just waiting for the translation to finish. You're suggesting, sir, with your headset on, would China be able to sell its sovereign bonds, or would it continue to buy U.S. bonds?
Да. Ну, я думаю, сможет, раз Россия продал.
Sell its own bonds. Okay.
Облигации.
Go ahead.
Well, if they keep paying interest forever, they'll be able to sell their bonds.
Thank you. I didn't get that because the translation. So,
It's already
Мне
started
кажется,
selling
проблема
its
перевода.
bonds.
okay, it's adjusted its portfolio over the last year. Could this be a shock to the global economy, though? And I've always wondered in the back of my mind, it would cost China dearly. But if they really wanted to wake up President Trump, they could sell quite aggressively their U.S. holdings. And that would be really reject this concept of a soft landing pretty fast. Once we have the three of you weigh in, is that part of the toolbox that China's holding back, or is it just not considered as an option? Stanley?
I mean, we don't know how far this dispute is going to go, but at some point they may well use that they have a right to do it. I suspect they won't, but the situation could get much more dire than it is right now.
When you were at the Federal Reserve, would you ever thought that the Chinese would do something like that, or is it just took a certain kind of president to get it to that situation?
Well, you always discuss the Chinese might sell their bonds. I mean, that was a question you asked, but I don't think that we thought it was imminent in any way, and it may be becoming more imminent as time goes by.
Well, this is pretty profound stuff. Justin, why don't you jump in here?
Well,
This is high risk. This is not an easy managing to a soft landing if we go to that sort of.
Well, the
climate.
trouble is, for it to be very effective, the Chinese would have to hurt themselves quite a lot. So,
Yes.
I'd like to come back to the growth issue.
Okay. Let's stay on this subject first, because it's a sensitive one. The gentleman had a question about interest rate.
Happy to weigh in.
Yeah, go ahead, Maurice.
Yeah.
But Justin, do you want to address it, or do you think it's just too politically sensitive?
Well, the large holding of U.S. Treasury as a way to influence U.S. policy has been a subject discussed by quite a number of scholars, including like Larry Summers and so on. And certainly, if China shares a large amount of U.S. Treasury, it will cause interest rate to increase sharply. But China is a responsible stakeholder. We don't want to threat any country. We hope to have good relations. We hope the global economy will grow dynamically, and also China also like to grow dynamically.
So that would be the nuclear option, Maurice?
Yeah,
Not to do anything would be the status quo.
Yeah. You know, in addition to pushing for lower short-term interest rates in the U.S., and I stress short-term because that's where the Fed is active, President Trump has called for a weaker dollar. Selling those treasuries weakens the dollar, so he would love that, I presume. There might be some upward pressure on longer-term yields, but you know, it's not clear which way that cuts. So I agree that China is not likely to make such an aggressive action, but it's also not clear to me that it would pressure the U.S. very much in a world where, after all, there is a shortage of safe assets, and the treasury securities are the safe assets par excellence. The market wants those assets.
We know the CNN position, how we cover Donald Trump. It's partially because we get very good ratings and probably very good income out of it because our ratings are higher. But I've had 4 or 5 different business people come up to me in the last 24 hours and say, you know, Donald Trump's much smarter than you guys are giving him credit for. He's thought it all through. Doesn't sound like him when he talks about the tariffs mechanism and who's paying for the tariffs and the trade action. But does he have a point to push China in this direction right now on the trade front? And in the end, he may be correct, even with Fed policy, that maybe we're being too timid. Maybe we should be more aggressive with China on trade. Maurice?
Well, I think the Fed will react if the trade warfare leads to a palpable slowdown in the economy that is likely to carry with it a downward revision in the inflation forecast. So I don't think they'll be directly responding to they'll be responding to damage to the economy, and that's not something that he wants to do. On how much he has thought these things through, it is hard to know whether some of his statements reflect misunderstanding or simply a spin for public consumption. I do think on these issues of bilateral trade deficits, as Justin has said, there's a fundamental misunderstanding.
Okay. Did you have one more question? And then
Второй вопрос у меня, господин.
Yes, I have the second question to Mr. Yuan. After the trade wars, to keep up the trading balance on appropriate level, can they devaluate their national currency, yuan? What will be the consequence? The reduction of their reserve currency, or it can impact on contracts with countries like Russia and the ability to conclude other contracts. To keep their payment balance in China, can the Central Bank of China devaluate their national currency by administrative or economic measures? Можно передать микрофон другим участникам аудитории, пожалуйста? Хороший вопрос. Китай уже заявил, что существующая система
Basically, based on the market principle, but to avoid sharp fluctuation of the currency. And China is a country. When China announces a policy, we will stick to the policy. That's one thing. And secondly, because we adopt managed floating, if the trade war erupted, certainly that will put a downward pressure on China. And because any theory indicates that. However, the US warned China cannot depreciate the currency. On the one hand, China, say China should be a market economy, but US said China cannot depreciate currency. So I think there's a contradiction in that. But I think China will honor its promise to have a managed floating.
A managed float.
Yeah.
Dr. Fischer, you want to weigh in on this and the kind of the pressure on the renminbi? I saw the easing of the currency just last week, as a matter of fact.
Well, the rate is moving around a little bit in the current situation. I don't see anything inappropriate by what's been done so far. I don't see any use of exchange rate policy as a means of fighting back against the United States, but that could happen. And I don't think at this stage that we need to think that this is coming immediately, but it may come if Trump keeps going. He may finally get some reaction from China other than the ones we've seen so far, which is to follow his steps.
Right. Any questions from the floor as well? I've got a whole slew of questions here, but please, Carlo, if we can get a microphone here. And do we have a second question after that? Please raise your hand so we can move this forward, please.
In the discussion about soft landing, very little attention has been paid so far on the role that Europe could potentially play. I remember that in around 2010, 2013, within the G20, the big issue was about China appreciating the currency and reducing the surplus. And on this, by and large, China has delivered. The surplus has declined quite substantively. Conversely, Europe moved from a position of basic balance, the euro as a whole. Germany had a surplus. Now, Germany's surplus has increased sharply. Europe as a whole has been sucking up demand from the rest of the world in an environment of sluggish growth globally. So Europe could, I believe, do more to contribute to the soft landing. And I wonder what the distinguished panelists think that could be an effective way to lead Europe, and especially Germany, to be more responsible from a macroeconomic point of view, taking this global picture into account.
Good. That's another comment. You said it in a nicer way, but Donald Trump's been complaining about Germany not serving its role as such a large economy. Maurice, I'm going to go into the audience too to take some of the questions, please.
No, well, I completely agree that, in a new global downturn, the countries in Europe with relatively more fiscal space, and Germany is the prime example, would need to mount a fiscal response. In fact, even some of those which you might regard now as highly indebted would need to mount a fiscal response because, I would view a deep recession as an emergency situation. Germany has the room. This year, in fact, policy is a little bit looser in the Eurozone, but still the general level of the surplus is viewed as, by the IMF as bigger than is justified by the fundamentals, and so there's room for expansion, even without a recession.
This morning, Jens Weidemann said that the attacks were right and that Germany should be running a more expansionary policy. So, well, that's...
He's running for something, right?
That possibility does arise.
And who takes over as the European Central Bank president? Do you have a preference?
I think that the issue of soft landing very much depends on whether the reserve currency countries, including US and Euro, to use that prestigious position and carry out some kind of soft monetary policy to create a space for the domestic structural reform. Because fundamentally, if we want to have a soft landing, then the domestic economy should resume to have a dynamic economic growth. And currently, what I see, they are not really doing that. They have the easy monetary policy, but they have not really carried out the necessary structural reform to help their economies to return to normal. And if that kind of situation continue for too long, there's a danger. Because when you keep the interest rate so low for so long, and it will cause certainly you do not see the inflation in the real sectors, but you see the bubble inflation. And I remember that in 2008, when I was first became the chief economist of the World Bank, at that time, the Dow Jones Index was 12,000. And everyone said there was a bubble in the equity markets. Now, 10 years later, the real economy has not really improved, but the Dow Jones index has been 25,000, more than doubled. So there's a danger there. And I hope this kind of danger can be causing our concern, and the government will carry out what really can help them to improve their real economy, instead of trying to do something superficial and at the end hurt the real economy.
Okay, good. Stanley, you wanted to jump in? Should I take a question from Jose?
You can take the question.
Well, I wanted to hear the views on non-China emerging economies, let's say. What is I mean, we have seen significant volatility in capital markets since last year. And of the past 2 weeks, actually, because of the confrontation between the US and China, volatility has been back with a bit of stronger force. So what should non-China emerging economies, what can they expect and what can they do to manage that financial volatility?
Stanley? Non-Chinese emerging markets, and we're in quite a volatile environment. I'm glad you brought the question up. Kazakhstan went through a commodity bust, during 2015-16. The vulnerabilities are not just there for Kazakhstan, but for the emerging markets. Corporate debt's extremely high in the emerging markets as well. Do you want to jump in, Justin, or any of the three?
One of the things that bothers me throughout this is what soft landing are we talking about? A country had the best soft landing in history, the United States. Came through this thing very delicately, got to full employment, no inflation, everything. Sorry, looking at that thing. I said that the United States came through this crisis with the softest landing, I think, that has been seen in a very long time. I don't understand what we're talking about the soft landing. Whose landings are we trying to soften?
Well, let's challenge that premise, because I've heard Christine Lagarde and the downgrade of the IMF to 3.3%. Is there anything out there that could provide the shock that people get worried about? I hear these things about storm clouds ahead. Is it just a false warning, Maurice? Stanley, you're not worried about this at all? If we come back in 2020 to the AEF, we would have said, we should have flagged it during this discussion about the global economy, that there is a vulnerability or not. Stanley, and then I'll have Maurice and Justin jump in. Thanks.
Well, sorry.
Go ahead, Stanley, please, first.
There is a problem in the global economy. It's not about a soft landing, it's about restoring growth. And that's a different story. What can be done? And I think that some of what can be done is that some of the Latin American countries, the West Latin American countries more than the East at the moment, should continue doing what they've been doing in the last couple of years. The other Latin American countries are having a problem, but that's related to domestic difficulties and domestic political difficulties. I'm thinking of Argentina particularly, but Brazil is not very different in some respects. So what can they do? They can change their policies. Are they going to change their policies? Well, probably, but after a lot of arguing about whether they should or they shouldn't. And these ones will have to be seen to be non-viable before they'll be put into, before changes will take place. So I expect for those countries that at the moment are having trouble adjusting, they will continue having trouble to adjust until the trouble is so large that they'll have to adjust. That's the usual way that these things happen, and it's very unfortunate that countries have not been able to make the adjustments that they should make. And then there's the United States-China trade war, and greater war than that is taking place. And there's where we have to think about what we're doing. But then we've got to ask ourselves, well, what are the prospects for this? I mean, I always like to read in the New York Times or somewhere, and Argentina must change its policies. Well, good, you've given the orders. Now, what happens? And did they actually read that in the way you'd like them to read it? And you've got to think of what the politics of doing what they want to do is. And sometimes they can't just do the things that we need. So I can't quite figure out. It's not that there are huge surprises about what can be done to restore growth. We're not talking about the great unknowns at the moment. That's the question. But that is the more interesting question than landing softly, because the problem may be we've landed too softly.
It's interesting because President Macri had a lot of support politically coming in by the G7 countries, and he hasn't leveraged it. Now we see Christina de Kirchner talking about coming back to make another run in the populist environment we're in. Justin, I know you wanted to come in on the comment and the question.
I think that Stan was right to say U.S. has very good soft landing since 2008. If you look at the performance. Not only so, before 2008, U.S. enjoyed 20 years of the so-called Great Moderation, right? But we also need to understand what are the reasons for that? What are the consequences for the rest of the world? I think the U.S. can manage soft landing is because U.S. dollars is global reserve currency. One thing. Secondly, also de-link to gold, and allow the U.S. monetary authority to use monetary policy to cope with the decline in the demand in the asset prices in the U.S. But since it's a global reserve currency, it has a consequence for the rest of the world. When we talk about, more than 2 decades of great moderation in the U.S., the cause was the fluctuation in the rest of the world has been much larger in those 20 and 5.
Was it the size of the capital markets in particular? Or is it?
And also, the U.S. great moderation, the sub-lending also causing some kind of large inflow and outflow of short-term capitals to other economies, and causing the challenge of the macroeconomic management.
Okay. I have another question from the floor. Go ahead, there's a microphone there. Thanks.
Just going back to discussion about China-US. What are the other measures that China potentially could have? We obviously discussed currency devaluation or dumping of treasuries. What is there that, this is widely discussed now after Huawei, is that the banning Apple in China. What China can really do, and maybe also what is the red line when China will start responding to these, let's say, provocations that Stanley mentioned, and what would make them react?
Justin, do you want to take it? Thank you for the question. Any other questions
I think the
here?
first one, U.S. unilaterally adopt some policies, and the U.S. is a superpower. We cannot do too much about it. But I think China will continue to open its economy, because if you look into trade, the export from China to the U.S. is only about 18% of the total export. We still have 82% of the rest of the world. And if China continue to open the economies, the growth in China will be good for other economies in the world. And I think that's a policy China will continue to pursue. And secondly, certainly, I do not say the trade with the U.S. will not have an impact on the Chinese economy. Certainly, it will have some kind of downward pressure on the Chinese economy. But fundamentally, China is a large economy. We can still rely on domestic economy to maintain reasonably good growth rate. And if time allows, maybe later, I'll explain why China should be able to maintain 6% and even above growth rate.
Okay, you know, there was an interesting question because you brought in the subject of Huawei, which I thought was fascinating. It took a little bit of time, but the chairman of Huawei did an interview with the BBC, which I think unearthed the true feelings of what China is thinking, but I'd love to get your view on this. He was saying that China can succeed without the United States. It's not overly dependent. And efforts to try to slow down Huawei in the area of artificial intelligence and 5G, the game is already over, that the technology and the advantage that China holds through Huawei is well ahead of its competitors in Europe and the United States. Is that truly what China thinks right now? That it's much stronger than the rest of the world or the United States is thinking? Do you want to address this, Justin? Because he was pretty aggressive. It took him a while to come out with it, but he was pretty aggressive. And I'm wondering if that's the view in Beijing as well within the government.
Well, we need to separate one company and the whole nation. And for the case of Huawei, I agree with Mr. Yuan. Actually, he prepared for that. He prepared. Yeah. You know, we need to distinguish one company from one nation. If you look at Huawei alone, actually Huawei prepares for that. Even US stock, the shipping all the necessary, components, including chip and so on, Huawei can survive. Because Huawei already prepared all the alternatives by domestic production. So Huawei can do without the US. But for the nation as a whole, certainly would like to have trade with any other country. And it's always, allow us to reach our economic scales and allow us to enjoy the complementarity with other countries. And under the kind of situation, the growth in China will be good for China, but also good for the world. And that should be, that should be a vision and also a practice that China, try to pursue.
Okay. Any other questions from the floor? Because I have one question to wrap. If there's no questions, I've already taken questions from you. Is there anybody else from the floor? I think because we have 5 more minutes left, I want to end on this thought. And let's be candid about it. If I'm sitting here in 2020, what is your biggest concern about a shock to the global economy now? Stanley, why don't you start, and then we'll finish with the panel here. What is your number one concern for 2019 and 20 as we sit today?
It is that the policies which the United States has continued to strengthen in the trade area are strengthened even further and lead to serious conflicts between the two great powers.
Good. Do you think it's protectionist, or there's merit to the fact that the Chinese have been slow to open up their very large economy?
I mean, it's very nice to give it names, but it's a phenomenon that's going to create a lot of difficulty.
Okay, I'm going to finish with Justin, but Maurice, why don't you take this?
I agree with Professor Fischer on trade, but I would raise two other issues. One of them longer term. For the near term, which you asked about, I worry about a cyber event having a major effect on international asset markets, financial markets particularly. I don't think regulators are really prepared for that. I don't think financial markets are prepared for this, and they could be doing a lot more in this area, and I don't really see it happening. Longer term, I would be remiss not to mention climate, and I think we are seeing very, very rapid deterioration, more so than we thought. The U.S. position of climate denial, pulling out of the Paris Accord, is incredibly unhelpful. But even with that, the entire world community is not doing enough on this issue.
Let me follow up quickly, and then I'll finish with Justin. Keep your microphone, if you don't mind, on. We seem to be very late predicting what's happening, late on the implications of lowering trade barriers in the WTO and globalization and the influence it would have on Western economies. Very late spotting, for example, the influence of data as a part of the technology boom and the whole business that it's created, moving into AI and then saying we could lose 500 million jobs by 2030. Is this a lack of leadership, or is this time compressed because of the digital revolution that followed globalization?
I think there's a lack of planning and of strategic thinking. I think partially this is the result of the short time frames of that governments occupy the political cycle, and there's a lot of if I look at the U.S., the politics there is very there's still a very strong prejudice in some areas against government action. The idea that somehow someone in Washington has to think about these issues of labor market policy, and but in fact, education, equipping workers with the skills they need is simply not going to take care of itself. This is not a problem the market can solve. So someone needs to be thinking about it, and the Trump administration, not only have they not done anything on infrastructure, but all of the noise seems to be about the U.S. getting ripped off, but there's a lot the U.S. can do to get its own house in order, and there's no discussion of that.
Good. So a lot of discussion, not a lot of action, I think, is the point too, right, to Stanley's point. Justin, why don't you finish your thoughts on your biggest concerns for this period over the next year?
Well, I'm concerned about the survivor of the WTO. I think that after the Second World War, the Bretton Woods system, create a global architecture, and that provide the global cooperation and for the developing country to develop. And now we see the Bretton Woods system has been weakened. The first one, the de-link of the US dollar to gold, that's one thing. And secondly, now whether this multilateralism in the global trade will be continue to survive. And I think that if the system breaks down, it will be, create a challenging environment for all the developing countries.
John, sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah, I'd love to.
It's not that things were not anticipated, it's that there were judgments made about them. Letting China into the WTO was a big political issue, and the Clinton administration decided to go ahead and do it after it thought it could get it through the Congress. You remember that it was a very unpleasant visit to Washington by, who was it? By Zhu Rongji, right?
I thought it was Jiang Zemin, but I don't remember.
No.
I can't remember.
Anyway, and Bob Rubin sent him back without an agreement when he'd expected to have one. That was a political decision. So it's not that it wasn't anticipated, it wasn't thought about. It's that it was a risk that the United States decided to take. And it has consequences. That's what we're dealing with now. But it's not that we don't see these things.
Well, I'm thinking something further down, though. I mean, I don't think when they lowered trade barriers within the final GATT round going into the WTO, the biggest debate, and I covered it, was intellectual property rights at the time and the U.S. flooding Europe with films. Nobody was worried about the competition coming from China, India, and Southeast Asia, and the implications on globalization is what I'm saying, which has led into populism. So it's kind of a longer range planning that our political systems don't really allow for, Stanley, in the West. You'd agree with that, I think.
It's very hard to argue with you. On the one side, you're very pleased that markets are unpredictable. On the other side, you wish we would predict everything accurately.
All I can do is laugh about that. I don't have a preference one way or the other, but it's interesting nonetheless. My final point on this subject matter, aren't these multilateral institutions set up for failure because people want instant gratification in this kind of new hyper world we live in? Isn't it difficult for the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the United Nations without the reforms to respond quicker, to this sort of environment? Who sees them surviving if people are waiting for a president to tweet and say the WTO doesn't move fast enough, Justin?
Well, you know, certainly
We just have to wait out the next 2 years or the next 7 years. Is that the reality?
You know, I think it's a challenge for everyone, for those people working in this multilateral development institutions, and also for members of these multilateral development institutions. And I hope, you know, at the end, that we will, you know, go beyond that. And at the end, the economic rationality will prevail.
Okay. One thing I say as an American, although I haven't lived there for so long, I'm very proud of our Constitution because it's withstood like multiple tornadoes, and it's so far so good, is what I have to say. But it's been a challenging period of time. A nice round of applause both to our audience for asking the questions and the three distinguished panelists. Thank you very much.